I'm going to start with this big question of must we change? And I'm going to tell you the answer right up front. Yes, absolutely, we must change. Our climate is changing right now. We are already feeling the impacts of this change, and it's only going to get more extreme and get more worse and impact more people. So yes, we absolutely must change. And hopefully by the end of this part, you will be convinced if you're not already convinced. So if we think about our planet Earth, we are unfortunately spewing 152 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the thin shell of our atmosphere every single day. We're treating our atmosphere as if it were an open sewer, and this just can't continue. If we think about this idea of climate change, it's often connected with the greenhouse effect. And sometimes the greenhouse effect gets a bad rap for this, but the greenhouse effect is absolutely necessary for our planet to be habitable. Our Earth on average is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and without these, I apologize. We're going back. Without our atmosphere containing some greenhouse gases, our atmosphere would be significantly colder and our planet would not be as habitable as it is today. So we get this energy coming from the sun. It warms the Earth. The Earth absorbs this energy and it radiates it back out. Some of it escapes into space, but some of it is getting absorbed by greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So having some greenhouse gases is good, it's essential, we need them. But unfortunately, the concentration of our greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is increasing more and more and more, and this layer is getting thicker and thicker, and we're trapping more heat. And so while we need the greenhouse effect, this idea of global warming is really where the problem is coming in, because we're getting much hotter, much faster than we ever have in Earth's history. So if we start thinking about the effects that global warming is having, we're seeing them happening today, right? We can simply look at temperature data and we see this drastic increase in temperature over time. The majority of our, hottest years on record have all happened in the past decade, in the past 20 years, 30 years, right? And if we think about this year, 2020, there's a really good chance, there's a 72% chance that 2020 will be the new record. It'll be the new hottest year ever in recorded history, that as long as humans have been around. So this is pretty extreme. If we think about this heat and its connection to Georgia, we've had record-breaking heat here in Georgia, right? We think back to just last fall, we think back to September through October 2019, we had a record number of days above 90 degrees. And it wasn't just in Atlanta. We had record-breaking heat all over the state. We had it in Atlanta, we had it in Athens, Columbus, and Macon. So we're really seeing this heat here in Georgia, and we're feeling it, and it's getting bad. As a result of all of this record-breaking heat in the fall of 2019, it had consequences, right? There was a lack of rain, there was record-breaking heat, and this led to the rapid development of drought all across the southeastern part of the United States, and Georgia was not excluded from this. You can see as we go through the fall, we go through end of August into early October here, and we're seeing the Southeast seeing extreme drought conditions. If we think about Georgia, we're seeing abnormally dry conditions, moderate drought, and even some spots where we had severe drought. If we think about 2020 with temperature, we're on track for it being the hottest year ever, right? This is data from July 2020, and we're seeing record warms all over the country. And it's not just our country. We're seeing record warms all over the world, right? We think about places that are supposed to be hot, like Death Valley, but it's not supposed to be this hot, right? Just in August, just not too long ago, it recorded the highest record temperature ever recorded on our planet at almost 130 degrees Fahrenheit. We think about our Arctic and our Antarctic. We're also seeing extreme temperatures here. Back in February, which is the summer for the Southern Hemisphere, we had a record-breaking temperature of almost 65 degrees down in Antarctica. We broke 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia. These are places that are supposed to be cold, and we're seeing this drastic warming of our entire planet. If we start thinking about the consequences of this warming, there's lots of things that we can think of. And wildfires is probably something that's on all of our minds a lot more now than it has in the past. So as our temperatures are rising, we're getting this snow melt happening earlier and earlier. And so our forests are getting drier and they're staying drier for longer periods of times. And these ecosystems are just prime for the ignition and spreading of wildfires. And we see that the fires are getting worse. They're larger and costlier than ever before. And their emissions are increasing global warming. They're making it worse. So as we get more fires, we get more rising temperature, which means way earlier snow melt and more forest fires. We've got this positive feedback loop that's going to keep going and going. And we have this data. We see that hotter years typically have more fires, right? We have the data to support these conclusions that we're making. If we think about other consequences of this warming, we're seeing a lot of ice melting. Here we have this an example from July of 2019 in Greenland, where 60% of the surface of Greenland's ice sheet experienced melting, losing more than 10 billion tons of ice in a single day, right? We're seeing melting all over the planet on both Greenland and Antarctica. We're seeing our glaciers melt. And as a consequence of all this melting, we're seeing an increase in sea level rise. Not only is sea level rising, it's rising at a faster rate than we've seen it before, and it's projected to keep rising at a faster rate. If we think about the impact of these rising sea levels on Georgia specifically, the Georgia coast has experienced over 10 inches of sea level rise since 1953, and Georgia DNR recommends that the coastal communities plan for anywhere between 4 and 6.3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. This means that we have over 178,000 people in Georgia that could be at risk for sea level rise impacts by 2100. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, are socially vulnerable populations. We have some of these examples already that we can see. We think about Tybee Island. People along the coast, particularly in Tybee Island, are really taking this climate change and sea level rise and loss of our marshes very seriously, because they're the ones that are already living with it. They're seeing greater tidal surges. They're seeing flooded roads. They're seeing really old trees being killed by saltwater intrusion. We're having this rise. We're feeling it now here in Georgia. This isn't something that's happening other places. This is happening here. If we think about coastal flooding in the Savannah area, we can look at kind of through time how much flooding would have occurred naturally, and we can compare this to the amount of flooding driven by climate-linked sea level rise. We're seeing the number of days of coastal flooding increasing, and we see that this is going to be connected, and this is connected to climate-related sea level rise. If we keep thinking about our oceans, right, while our atmosphere is getting warmer, it's not getting as warm as it could be, because our oceans are trapping this heat. It's also absorbing carbon dioxide, but it's trapping a huge amount of this excess heat. And we see evidence of this if we simply look at the temperature of our oceans over time. We're seeing that our ocean temperature set a new record in 2019, and similar to atmosphere temperatures, 2020 likely to set a new record. If we think about all the consequences of our climate change and how it's threatening our oceans, we can't just think about these increasing temperatures. We also have to think about our oceans becoming more acidic because it's absorbing lots and lots of CO2. And we're also creating environments in our oceans that contain less oxygen. So this is having an impact on our biosphere. So climate change and our oceans, we see sea level rise, we see coral bleaching, we see an increased number of toxic algae blooms, we're seeing loss of habitats, we're seeing ocean acidification, and a major disruption to our fisheries. And this is affecting the marine food web, but also local livelihood, people that depend on our marine ecosystem for their economy. Also people that eat and their food security is connected to oceans. They're having a huge impact. So lots and lots of problems connected to our oceans, all tied back to climate change. If we start thinking about other consequences, right? Lots and lots of consequences of this rising temperature. If it's warmer out, we're going to get more evaporation. More evaporation is going to lead to more precipitation. More precipitation is going to lead to more flooding because all of this extra water has got to get back to the ocean somehow. More water in our oceans, more evaporation. So we're constantly disrupting our hydrologic cycle, and we have evidence that this disruption is taking place. If we think about this precipitation component, we're seeing global record-breaking precipitation anomalies. We're getting more and more extreme precipitation events. We're getting these rain bombs. Maybe that's something that you've heard on the local news here in Newton County and in the state of Georgia. When we think about precipitation events, it's hard not to think about hurricanes. If we go back to 2018, we can think about the devastating effects Hurricane Michael had on Georgia. For the United States, it was the third strongest storm to ever hit. But if we think specifically about Georgia, it had a huge impact on our economy. It destroyed $2.5 million worth of crops in our state. Only 15% of our cotton crop was saved and harvested before this storm hit. If we go back one more year to 2017, we can think about Hurricane Irma, right? This is a storm that remained a Category 5 for 3 straight days, and this broke a new global record since we started having satellite tracking. So our storms are lasting longer, and they're staying at a higher intensity for even longer because our oceans are so warm, and it's this warm ocean temperature that is fueling our hurricanes. If we go back and still think about Hurricane Irma and its impact on Atlanta, this was the first storm where Atlanta had its first ever tropical storm warning. Normally we're so far inland that the storm has broken up enough and the winds have come down enough that we're not at that tropical storm stage by the time it gets to Atlanta. But these storms are stronger than ever, and we're feeling the impact of them further and further inland than we've ever seen before. If we think about 2016, we've got Hurricane Matthew, where we can see another example of how this increased precipitation and warm oceans has had an effect on the Georgia economy. And instead of affecting cotton this time, it devastated our pecan industry. Farmers lost as much as 1/3 of their pecan trees, and some of these trees were older than 100 years old. Right? We think about 2020 hurricane season. We're not done with it yet. So far, we've had 20 named storms, and on average, we only have 12. So we're seeing more storms. We think about the number of actual hurricanes relative to our average. So far, we have 7, and on average, we have 6. We've only had 1 major hurricane so far. Fingers crossed that we don't hit this forecasted number of maybe up to 6 storms. So overall, if we start thinking about worldwide extreme weather catastrophes, we're seeing an increase as we move through time. More extreme temperatures, more droughts, more fires, more floods, more mudslides, more storms, hurricanes, precipitation events, things like that. And we're seeing this impact financially as well. If we look at the number of billion-dollar disasters affecting the United States between 1980 and 2019, there is some variability up and down, but overall we have this trend where we're seeing more billion-dollar disasters in 2019 than we did in 1980. A lot of them are connected to the weather events. Severe storms and flooding have definitely increased relative to 1980. We're seeing these impacts, and they're getting worse. This idea of climate change is not just about environmental issues. We can also think about other impacts it's going to have on people and human populations. And the US Department of Defense made this quote. They've said that climate change will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions all over the globe. If we think about this impact of refugees on Atlanta, it's been projected that the Atlanta area could see up to 320,000 climate migrants by the end of the century due to sea level rise. And we also have this terrible statistic and this fact that climate change is the biggest global human health threat of the 21st century. right? This is not just about our environment being destroyed. This is about our environment being destroyed and human lives being lost. This is a human health threat. It's also an economic threat, right? We can look at all the costs associated with carbon and climate change, political instability, floods and mudslides, wildfires, droughts, storm damage, ocean acidification, infrastructure loss, climate refugees, species extinctions, melting glaciers, famine, water security issues, ecosystem loss, our way of life being disrupted, infectious diseases spreading, sea level rise, right? We can confidently make this conclusion that climate change is the #1 threat to the global economy. And it's not just the global economy, right? This, again, is not just happening elsewhere. It's happening here. And we can think about the American South and Midwest are expected to suffer the largest economic losses in the United States due to climate change. Extreme flooding, storm surges could cost us up to $60 billion a year by 2050. This is a huge economic impact that we're all going to have to bear. So must we change? The answer is yes, absolutely yes, 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 no doubt about it, yes.